Hi everyone, this is Vicki Janowski, editor of the Greater Wilmington Business Journal, and welcome to our roundtable discussion with District Attorney Ben David. Ben, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here, Vicki. Thank you for having me.
So I know lots of people in our area know Ben, are familiar with Ben. Many have probably had a chance to work with him either in the community or the district attorney's office. But just to give you a little bit background, Ben has been with the district attorney's office for basically 2 decades now. And if you think about the district attorney's office, it's not a way we normally think about it, but just the size of the attorneys on our staff is actually the largest law firm in our area. The 6th district, which Ben David is district attorney for, covers New Hanover and Pender counties. And he has been very active in the community, not just in his role, but also in discussing crime prevention and community involvement. So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about today, along with law enforcement and court issues that are coming up. And of course, as always, if you have questions, feel free to put it in the chat box and we will pass it over to you so you can ask Ben while we have him here for the next 45 minutes or so. So Ben, just to start us off, well, first of all, tell us, what is court like these days with COVID and with all the changes that have happened?
Courts are running and they've never really stopped. There's 100 counties and each has a courthouse. That's called the county seat. In New Hanover County, that's Wilmington, and in Pender County, that's Burgaw. Of those 100 counties, 66 of them at some point throughout this pandemic have had to close court functions at least for some period of time. Pender County closed 2 different times because of outbreaks among various court personnel. New Hanover's never had to close. We've been very lucky, and not just lucky, but very vigilant about social distancing. I'm only not wearing a mask now because I'm in my own personal office, but even when I'm walking around the district attorney's office, to say nothing of the common spaces, of course I have the mask on. We haven't had jury trials since March, and we're still a month away from those. November 2nd will be our first jury trials. But if you were to come here tomorrow, Vicki, you'd see over 800 people that are lined up outside waiting to hear a traffic ticket matter. We have pushed all those functions out into the elements and have tents outside. And so if people show us their paperwork for things like registration or inspection violations or insurance letters, those tickets are typically dismissed without them having to walk through the metal detectors to see a judge. If it's something for like signing up for a driving school to take care of a moving violation, we have driving school instructors outside. We tell them where and when to go next, and they never come into the building. It's only on more serious traffic matters, obviously things like DWIs and things that involve a court, where we need to have people come in to see the officer and who stopped them and see the judge for a trial. The vast majority are being handled administratively that way. And then for all other types of courts, we of course need the defendants, we need their attorneys, and we need a judge, but 98% of all justice is not with a jury, it's with those actors I just mentioned. So we've never stopped working.
So with the delay of the jury trial, so that's been this past 6 months, there haven't been jury trials. Is it a bottleneck now when it opens back up?
There is somewhat of a bottleneck, and I'm very pleased that the Administrative Office of the Courts, the AOC, has allowed me to hire additional staff at the non-attorney level to help with all of the things that are backing up right now, all the paperwork that goes into doing justice. So I'm hiring 7 new people actually that start today and through December 31st to help out with some of this backlog. But we're just going to need everyone's patience. When they come to the courthouse, we know it's a stressful time for everyone, and we still need jurors. We're still going to need the community to weigh in on the biggest cases. Many people will plead only when they see that a jury trial is imminent. So there's many cases that are in our jail right now, serious charges, rape, murder, armed robbery, habitual felons, who are not going to plead guilty, frankly, until they know that the jury is walking into the room. And so we expect many cases to start moving beginning next month, but it's going to take some time before we get into the complex cases that involve 50 witnesses in 3 or 4 weeks. We're going to start small with the 1 and 2 day trials. In fact, for November and December, we're not going to put on any trial that's longer than 2 business days. We're going to kind of get the training wheels off and see how this is going. We're going to have to socially distance jurors, literally putting them 6 feet apart in all directions, which is not your typical jury box. So we're having to refit courtrooms for that purpose. So we're going to do what we can. The governor calls it a dimmer switch approach, right? Where you don't just flick on the light and we weren't doing something and now we are. We're going to gradually come back into full operations. And I'm sure every business is like that.
Do you guys expect that you'll have a difficult time getting a jury pool? I mean, I know sometimes it is probably difficult in non-COVID situations to
Yes, we do anticipate that. And I particularly want to say that our seniors in general have always been great jurors. They tend to show up and participate. They want to serve. And because we know that many of them are immunocompromised or otherwise have comorbidity factors, which are something that they really have to guard against COVID exposure, we know that they're going to be one of the groups that puts their hand up in the air and asks for a deferment. And by law, you can do that starting at 72, but we expect that some people will be bringing that up even before that age. And we understand that. And my prosecutors are going to work with the community to obviously not make it a risky proposition for them while we're asking them to secure the safety of everyone by serving on a jury.
And months ago, you and I talked over Biz Talk, which is our regular interview show that we do on Facebook through the Business Journal. But at that time, we were talking about the outbreaks that were being seen in the jail settings and the prison settings. Particularly at that time, the state was looking to release certain group of offenders because that was a problem, cluster outbreaks. I believe Pender's facility saw some as well. Just to check back in, because that was several months ago, does it seem like that's gotten more under control, or is that still an ongoing issue?
It really got under control. In fact, I want to compliment Sheriffs Cutler and McMahon in particular for the detention facilities they're in charge of, and also the 2 prisons in my district, 025, which is the one across from the airport, and then there's one in Burgaw that has almost 800 people in it. They have really done what they can to limit the spread of COVID within there, and obviously very tight confinement that doesn't have the benefit of being able to keep everyone socially distant. We have really utilized technology to keep them there and us away from having to bring them here through video first appearances, video pleas, conferences that involve remote technologies. We've upfitted courtrooms for that purpose. We've brought in things that frankly were developed right here in Wilmington that are now spreading out throughout the state. We had a 10-year head start on this use of technology because when our jail moved to Blue Clay Road about 15 years ago, we already utilized some of that for efficiency, and we were greatly able to expand that for in-custody defendants when COVID hit 6 months ago. So we have had a much better experience than many other districts keeping defendants safe through all this.
And just to switch off the COVID topic real quick, I also want to make sure we talk a little bit about your presence in the community and discussing crime over the years. So as I mentioned earlier, you've been in the DA's office for 20 years, been elected DA since 2004, I believe, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
So I bring that up because there's some symmetry there in our most recent Wilmington Biz magazine is kind of our 20-year look back and our 2020 in Biz project. And just looking through those old Business Journal issues in the year 2000, one thing that struck me was the Chamber's priority list that year. Well, for one thing, many things are still on there that are currently on there now. But one of those issues was crime in the port city being a major concern and continues to be a concern for community leaders and those in law enforcement and the DA's office such as yourself. So let's spend a little bit of time and talk about that. You know, you've been very involved in that from the beginning, a founder of the prevention, the Blue Ribbon Commission as well. So what have you noticed then, you know, over the years about whether that issue has changed in nature or gotten better or gotten worse? What's your perspective?
Well, you know, I like to start with numbers because data, I think, is what many of us use to look at kind of the 30,000 foot view. As we sit here today in October of 2020, we have the lowest recorded crime rate in the history of our city. Full stop. That's where we are. Now, are we satisfied? Of course not, because any murder, any armed robbery, any theft is unacceptable. And we can always do better. But we should acknowledge that there's been some great work that's been done. And, you know, the last person who should be taking credit for that is me. I give it to the community. I mean, when you think about all the initiatives that have been out there, I remember in 1999, the day after Columbine, when I started in this office as a young prosecutor, they had Vision 2020. I don't know if, I'm sure your magazine and newspapers have talked about this, where we've said, what do we want Wilmington to look like 20 years from right now? Well, here we are. And we said, we're going to connect both bridges with a walkway on the river. No one believed that was possible. They talked about a convention center. They talked about all the economic investment that was going to come down to the historic district. All that's happened. So a lot of good has come through that development. But really, why we have the lowest crime rate right now is because we've had many different groups coming together to say justice is everyone's concern. We've had business leaders like Chip Mahan say, you know what, I'm not only going to have a bank and Encino that's going to have 1,500 employees, but I'm going to make sure that people get back to work through something that Ben and I start called hometown hires. And we've put 200 people to work just last year under what's now Step Up Ministries. We had Judy Gerard, who's a retired CEO from New York and ran the Food Network, who came here and said, how about an all girls charter school where instead of 40% of the girls dropping out, all 100 will graduate. And instead of 8 going to college, 93 will go to college. And she started GLOW. We could talk all day long about the incredible nonprofits that are out there. People like Frankie Roberts or Margaret Weller Stargell or Amy Thief, you know, working with the victims I see and the people who need second chances who I see. You look at, you know, what else is going on in government and the bipartisan and nonpartisan ways that people are getting together right now. I was working with the Koch brothers on expungement relief. I mean, who would have thought that Democrats and Republicans would come around the table on a second chances initiative like that? And then the faith-based community. I mean, if you look at the old jail that's now the Harrelson Center, and you talk about a place of incarceration when I became DA is now a place of transformation. And the 20 different groups that are working with domestic violence, human trafficking, second chances like the Hometown Hires group that's in there, and on the list goes. I believe that we're safer and healthier as a community today because of everything that's going on outside of the courthouse. And that's why I've been so involved with trying to involve them in this justice initiative.
And you mentioned several of those community leaders. I know we were talking earlier. So you've been meeting with some of them recently for kind of a new project that you're working on. And also what you're about to be a published author. Is that what you're adding to your resume?
That's right. Thank you for bringing that up, Vicki. So for the last 5 years, I've been teaching a class at UNCW called Crime and Community in the Cape Fear. And that's not only for approximately 75 undergraduates for college credit. We've always included community members to include Osher Long Life Learning Institute folks, OLLI students, and also members of police forces and sheriff's offices who come in and basically watch 8 different nights of what some of the most defining cases are in this region and lessons learned from them, and some of the outreach efforts that we believe are preventing crime. Because of COVID, I haven't been able to meet with everybody. So instead, what we did this year is I actually hired a film crew to go around the district with me, to go into a jail cell with Ed McMahon and then to prison at 025, but also right next door to meet with Frankie Roberts, who I just mentioned, to go over to True Colors Brewery and not only interview George Taylor, but talk to some guys who are gangster disciples and in the Bloods and say, you know, if you're putting, you know, heroin out on the streets, I got to put you in jail. But if you're selling beer, I'll have the first one. Talk to me about what this thing is. You know, I'm interviewing people like Chip and Judy, who I just mentioned, and say, why have you, when you could have spiked the ball and lived behind a gate, come out and put yourself out there to do something like this? And so I've interviewed about a dozen community leaders but also people within the justice system, like Ed McMahon and Donnie Williams, people like Jay Corpening and James Faison, who are district court judges, who are, you know, running drug courts or seeing the opioid epidemic up close with our children, and the fact that, you know, 5 times as many are being born addicted at New Hanover Regional Medical Center right now than 7 years ago. And we're saying that's not acceptable. And even if that's not a criminal case, that's a tragedy of immense proportions. What can we do right now to stop that so that that child has a different future? That's what I mean by community-based prosecution. That's why I've written the book called Crime and Community that is coming out through a San Diego group called Cognella, a textbook publisher. And I'm very excited to involve the whole community in these 8 podcasts that I'm putting together right now, that we're rolling out 1 a week right now for the Ollie class that's up and running. It's soon going to be online, available for all law enforcement for free, as well as, you know, everyone else listening. We're going to be able to deliver that service to them through Ollie and Cape Fear Community College and other places.
Courthouse Dog just made an appearance too, by the way. I'm
Is
not the only
in
one.
here now? Yeah, he wanders around the office looking for someone to feed him, so he's probably out and about right now. This is lunch after all.
No, fantastic. It's a very 2020 way to have a meeting now. So the videos that you're talking about, and you mentioned some podcasts and that, where you plan on rolling that out at? Is that, how would this initiative look like in the community, I guess?
So, you know, for the office that I run, people can go to newhanoverda.com or penderda.com in order to handle their traffic tickets online without even needing to come down to that line I just mentioned, or see when their court date is, or look at a defendant and where they might be in custody for a case we've just handled. There's like an inmate locator function. That's all the DA side of the house. With this podcast I'm putting together, I've actually created my own website called benjaminrdavid.com. And they can see the TED Talk that I gave this time last year, which talks about the 5 arms of the starfish, all centered around public health and basically how we're reducing crime by building community. It will then guide you to the 8 online lectures that are going to accompany the book and ways to order the book. That website, that people can go to it today, but it's candidly under construction. We only have 3 of the 8 lectures actually online, and you need a password for it by being an enrolled student. So I would recommend people go there right now and look at the TED Talk and just navigate around it. And if they want to order the book, I'd love to involve them in a future class, because hopefully we're making people more informed about how this idea of justice is everyone's concern, and this community belongs to all of us, and bringing people to the table, listening to some of the voices off stage is what's making us a better place to live and work.
I want to touch on some of the specific issues that you were just talking about, Ben, and these are areas that you've had initiatives for in the past. One being gang violence, you've spoken out about before, and the other being opioid addiction. Everyone remembers when Wilmington had the dubious distinction of landing on the list of being, you know, the #1 in the country in terms of opioid addiction. So that really seemed to light a fire to address it from a number of fronts in the community. So that's been several years now, and you had spoken out about it as well, and about the prosecution on the laws on the books and stuff. So just kind of, I guess, give us an update on what the progress has been on that issue and how much more work still needs to be done from what you're seeing through the cases.
Well, it starts at the hospital, right? Because 8 out of 10 heroin users started with pills, and 75% of them started with someone else's pills. And so limiting, quite literally, the supply of legal drugs is something we absolutely need to do. And so I want to start by complimenting the largest employer in my district, and that's New Hanover Regional Medical Center, because they were the ones who said, we're not going to be party to this. There was a 4-fold increase in overdose deaths because there was a 4-fold increase in the rate of prescription opioids being prescribed out there in America. And last year we lost 64,000 Americans to this abuse, including 1 a week in my district. So what the hospital did is they said, we're going to stop handing out this medicine at the emergency department. We're going to limit the number of pills that we prescribe to someone after a knee operation, because if they need pills, they can come in and get more. But if we give grandma 50 pills and she only needs 7, what happens to the other 43? And the answer is it's at a trail mix party at a high school or a college. And so the STOP Act that the local delegation passed to say we're going to stop using prescriptions to get this supply onto the street says the most pills a doctor can give out now is 8 pills. And if you need more, we can just keep refilling your prescription. And that started at New Hanover Regional Medical Center. So that was the first big breakthrough. The second was because of a heartbreaking case where officers, of course, are using Narcan to bring people back to life so that they don't die of these overdoses. And because of the laws that says you have immunity when someone else calls 911, because we want to encourage people to seek medical treatment if they're in distress, officers couldn't even be making arrests of the people that were literally being revived. One young man who we revived over a several-year period 4 different times drove impaired for yet another time and then killed a 3-year-old child named Mason Richardson right there in front of Independence Mall. Now, we convicted him of second-degree murder. He's in prison for 15 years, but that's not the point. The point is, we now form a team called the Quick Response Team. Coastal Horizons is running that. That's why Margaret Weller Stargell is talking with me about what they're doing in the community, because this Quick Response Team now shows up within 48 hours of an overdose at the person's front door and says, here's a peer of yours who's walked the journey. Here's an officer, here's a medical professional. You need to get into treatment or you're going to kill yourself or someone else. And over the last couple of years that the QRT has been operational, 81% of all people who have met with the QRT have navigated voluntarily into treatment and remained there at least 6 months after they've been brought in. That's a safer community. That's the prescription for how we can be healthier as a society. And so that's how we're going to keep everyone safer. So I think we've learned some tragic lessons from some terrible cases in this building for what the hospital, what nonprofits like Coastal Horizon can do to really help this epidemic. We're also going hard on drug dealers. We're putting them in jail, $1 million bonds if they are peddling this poison for profit, specifically heroin and fentanyl. We are seeking longer sentences for death by distribution, knowing that if you give drugs or sell drugs to someone that they die, that should be charged like murder. And so we passed that tough law recently. So all of those things have come about since probably the last time you and I had this discussion. And I'm very thankful for the tools that are in place to help us with this epidemic.
Okay, and then moving over to how about gang violence and addressing that. You mentioned George Taylor and True Colors. We actually had them on yesterday as part of the conference, and they gave an update on the brewery plans and what they're doing. But outside of them and just the community at large, how, in terms of activity, in terms of the court cases you see, that was another area that you've spoken out about in the past. What's going on there?
Well, we still have a problem with the gang violence. There's no question. And you can read the headlines and watch TV as easily as I can and see what we're talking about. COVID has brought about many challenges. And one is the lack of structure for our youngest citizens. I mean, kids are not in school right now, and many aren't really online when they're supposed to be. And so that's a recipe for other people giving them structure. And when they find it in each other, that's called a gang. Obviously, we want them to have structure at home or through these 5 arms of the starfish. Right now, because we're in the middle of this, a lot of those structures that we rely on to keep kids safe and healthy just aren't there. And so this is a particularly tough time for gang violence. A few things that I think are important here. When we filed an injunction to say, you guys can't hang out with each other anymore on the street, again, look at the numbers. We reduced violent crime by dramatic levels in places like Creekwood and in the North Side in our youth enrichment zone, where these gangs were doing open air drug transactions and where they were congregating. No question that helped. And we specifically said, we still want you to succeed. You're still allowed to go work at a legitimate place. 8 of George's members of his team actually were subject to that injunction, and they were all allowed to work at True Colors during it. And when I was having lunch with them this time last week, I was cheering their success and saying, the reason I did that was not to pick on you guys. I'm trying to keep you alive. because you're 60 more times likely to be killed in America if you're a member of a gang. And we're trying to get you to a place where you're safe now, and you can't be. I love what George is doing, by the way. I mean, on Wednesday, I don't know if you shared this with the group, I didn't get to watch, but he literally took them skydiving and said, you know, if you're going to leave your comfort zone, you're going to have to do something, just as you get jumped into a gang by getting beaten into it. I'm going to say, before you can come into this place after 2 months of onboarding, you're going to have to literally jump out of an airplane. Most of these guys have never been in an airplane, and now they're jumping out of it for their first ever trip. And I talked to some of them about that experience, and they said, you know, maybe all of us need to leave our comfort zone, Mr. David. And I said, you know what? That's why I'm here, because you know, it's not very politically popular for many DAs, sheriffs, chiefs to say to a gang member, we want you to succeed. But I say that wholeheartedly. I don't want them to do violence, but I understand why it is that they're seeking the community that they're in. And it's actually not a crime to be in a gang. It's a crime to commit, you know, joining forces to commit crimes. And so if we can take some of that entrepreneurship, if we can take some of that, you know, loyalty that they have, that team building that they have, and turn it towards something good. I know that's a bold concept, but that's what Wilmington is all about. We try to innovate. And I think also with the gangs, we need to remember that not all youth violence is gang related. A lot of it's just young people committing violent acts. And while we worked hard to raise the juvenile age starting in December of last year from 16 to 18, and we were the last state to do that, we are still absolutely unapologetically taking 15, 16, 17-year-olds into the adult system if they're committing real serious crimes. And so we're going to continue to bind over those cases and treat them harshly if they're doing that, whether they're in a gang or not.
George did mention the skydiving. I think we're going to do that for our company holiday party. I'm going to pitch that.
He offered to take me, and I said, man, I did that when I was 25, and I got too much to live for now. Back then, I could have maybe done it, but I don't think Steffi would let me at this point. She's watching, by the way, so she's probably going to beat me up on that one.
Nice. So we covered those topics. Are there any other areas of activity that is a concern for you these days? You know, I don't know if things have changed because of COVID. One thing I was curious, you mentioned that the crime rate is down significantly. Is that a sustainable thing, or is that because of just people being further apart right now?
Well, some of it candidly is because it's unreported right now, and we know that. I'll give you just one small example. The worst cases in the criminal justice system involve child sexual abuse and physical abuse, right? I think all of us would agree with that. We generally get kids reporting that victimization to a social worker or to a counselor at school, or telling a friend on a playground. Because they're isolated right now, some of those kids have nowhere to reach out to. And so we know those cases are happening. And so when I'm with Amy Feith tomorrow at Carousel Center as part of this podcast that I'm filming, and we're talking about this dynamic, we know that it's not that crime isn't happening, it's not being reported. The same thing with, you know, a traffic stop, you know, where someone might have a headlight that's out or a registration that's no longer valid. Officer has a lawful basis to stop that car and then can search it incident to that stop. And that's where you find guns and drugs. Well, there's been fewer of those stops, right? Because obviously you have to limit the contact officers are having with everybody right now. They're still doing their job, to be clear, but they're not doing the technical stuff that leads to other stuff with the same frequency that they did before this pandemic because of this pandemic. So some crime is down because of that. People are at home more, so it's harder to break into someone's home to rob it when the family of five is there. Domestic violence, however, is way up, and that's because people are around each other a lot more. There's a lot more stress. The patterns are thrown off. So some things are down, some things are up. Overall, the opioid epidemic is still happening as well. I mean, again, that does not take a holiday, and it doesn't care about a pandemic. So there are different crimes that we could talk about, different trends that we can see. Overall, it's never been safer to live in the port city than right now. Traffic is way down, at least it was at the height of the pandemic. And, you know, we would average 15 wrecks in Wilmington on any given day. We were down to one in the months of March and April because of this. So there are some things that are way different because of the pandemic. But what I'd say in terms of this 20-year journey you just mentioned, where you're, you know, Wilmington Biz, just like me, have been looking at all this, we're a much better place in many ways, but there are still people falling through the cracks. And I think that the way, if I were to look out for the next 20 years, that we can succeed even more, is that we use the same great science that we do here in the courthouse to solve cases and prove them beyond a reasonable doubt. The same great science that we use to talk about how we can flatten curves and keep us all safe and alive. We can use that same science to predict crime and actually prevent it. And that's why I'm passionate about the Resiliency Task Force and what they're doing with adverse childhood effects, with childhood trauma. Again, if you go to benjaminrdavid.com and just watch that TED Talk if you haven't seen it, it's about ACE scores. It's about the 5 arms of the starfish. It's about my vision for involving the community for the next 20 years on what we can do to reduce crime even more and make this an even better place to live.
Okay, and obviously part of the discussion in this community, but also communities around the country this year, has been that around social justice and racial justice issues, particularly where they intersect with law enforcement and the court system. Since Memorial Day, there have been protests both here and in other cities, very different in nature, and I know there's the level of activity still going on here. So I want to talk a little bit with you about how that conversation is going and what your role is in that discussion with the community.
Yeah, I've obviously been very involved with that, and I've actually went to Minneapolis shortly after George Floyd was killed. So I saw it with my own 2 eyes what was going on there, and I obviously have seen what's been going on within my district. Couple of things. First of all, it is a great American tradition to have the right to peacefully protest. That's the first thing we enshrined in our Bill of Rights. And so I respect and actually really appreciate that there are people out there, not just online, but out on the streets saying we can do better and we're going to hold you accountable in the court system for doing better. Thank you. Where have you been? We've been needing you for years. Please don't leave, is what I would say to that. But what we are not going to tolerate is violence, looting, some of the things that other communities have really been experiencing. And so, without apology, the sheriff, the chief, and I, the mayor, we all got together right at that early stage in the end of May and early June and say, we are going to shut it down if you're bringing guns into this. We are not going to have it if you are violating the curfews, because we want peaceful demonstrations, but we don't want what they're seeing for 100 days in Portland or what they're seeing in all the other communities, Kenosha, that we can talk about. And so, we simultaneously say, we're going to have order. We're going to choose community over chaos, but we do need to have these community conversations. That's why I've done these podcasts. We've been talking to people who I think need to be heard, including the people at True Colors that I just mentioned. As for the protests, some of those trials are now taking place. We had one last Friday. 3 defense attorneys on the other side. One of my prosecutors went up against all of them and convicted them, because we weren't doing technical violations. We're talking about people with, you know, following officers with cell phones for 10 and 12 hours and yelling obscenities at them and trying to bait them in. And the officers were like, we respect your right to protest, even though most mortals would have arrested them hours earlier. We're talking about gun offenses. We're talking about people who were sitting in traffic and trying to be disruptive. That's stuff that we're like, you know what? If you want to finally get arrested, we're gonna do that. But as it relates to, I think, what people are talking about, which is structural inequality and systemic racism, we need to have that conversation. You know, officers, prosecutors, many of us have gone through implicit bias training and understand the role that, even on a subconscious level, race plays. We understand that an African-American family has less than 10% of the wealth of an average white family. And that shows up at the courthouse in all sorts of ways. We understand that violence comes from clustered poverty that we call public housing. And we're doing everything we can in this courthouse to treat people fairly under the Equal Protection Clause. But justice should not be just an event. It should not be hashtag activism. It should not be getting a selfie in front of whatever statue you think needs to come down next. It needs to be a sincere effort, I think, over a long period of time and a sustained strategic plan. And that's what I believe we've been doing in places like the Blue Ribbon Commission, in some of the initiatives I've mentioned earlier. This is not something that is just an event, it's a process. And just one small example of that, and then I'll stop talking. Just during this pandemic, we've passed the most sweeping laws in the country related to the Second Chances Initiative. This is something that I went to Raleigh to actually help champion, to say, if you've been clean for 10 years and you have only one nonviolent felony or misdemeanor on your record, it should be removed. And the reason I said that as your prosecutor is because even one nonviolent felony on someone's record reduces their future earning potential by 40% over their lifetime. So we're going to create a permanent underclass in this country for nonviolent felonies. That's why I said we needed to raise the juvenile age, and why Jay Corpening was saying we need a school justice partnership to stop the school to prison pipeline. We're doing those things, which happens to have a disproportionate effect on people of color, because it's the right thing to do. And when we do that, when we have my prosecutors dismissing thousands of cases during this pandemic, they allow people to get their licenses back because they can't pay the tickets. Or when we dismiss 7,000 offenses involving 16 and 17-year-olds from prior convictions because they would have been eligible for this relief if they had committed the offense today. We've been doing that when no one's watching because it's the right thing to do. And we think we're keeping you safer by involving more people in community and ending the structural inequality that everyone's talking about.
Ask you, how formalized or organized or how often is your communication with Sheriff McMahon and now Police Chief Donnie Williams on these issues when you're talking about?
So I like to think we're all good friends. We've known each other for years, and we all have each other on speed dial. So we frequently communicate. Candidly, it has fallen by the wayside during the pandemic that we need to get back a formalized chiefs meeting that's once a month, where we like to get together and just share ideas and share what's going on throughout the district. Because of social distancing, we have not been able to do those lunches that we've liked to done in the past. We still converse all the time through phone calls and even Zoom calls. We have also, and we have one at 2 o'clock today, critical case reviews, where when we have something big out there that we think we really need to pay a little extra attention on, one of their detectives, one of their officers comes in and presents the case to a panel of several of my senior prosecutors and me. And we say, what should we do with this case? What are the, charges? What are the defenses? What's the evidence that still could be collected at a critical stage? What's a likely plea offer? If we're going to trial, what's the strategy? We do those with all sorts of cases. So my duty is to advise law enforcement, and there's over 1,200 officers on the street in 20 different police agencies. And so getting out into the community includes getting out to those 20 police stations, and that's never stopped, and nor will it ever.
You mentioned we were talking about the Second Chances Act and that legislation that was in General Assembly last year. Are there any other things you see coming down the pipeline, or other pieces of legislation like that that you expect that you'll want to be involved?
Well, and to be clear, while the testimony that I gave was last year, it actually got passed during COVID, and we're giving life to it right now. And one thing it's going to do, just so you understand, say it's something like a breaking and entering charge, and the kid was 17 and now he's 27. And that's the guy that's got 3 kids who can't support his family because no one wants to hire him. He's not allowed to live with his family if they're in public housing, because you're not allowed to with a felony. You're not allowed to go to the military. So now we're able to expunge his record because it's been 10 years. If that case, by the way, was dismissed or found not guilty years ago, that would still show up on his record. but that's not something that's really even his criminal record. Would you hire him? If you saw that, would you hire him? And here's the thing, even though people were eligible for that relief, 95+% were never seeking an expungement for those dismissed and not guilty cases because it's expensive and there's structural inequality. And so one thing that we changed under this new law is we said, now it's automatic for the people. If one of my prosecutors dismisses your case or you're found not guilty, that is automatically removed by an operation of a computer off your record. That's going to help thousands of people moving forward. So there is relief, and we're working hard pro se, meaning people who are representing themselves and with attorneys, to use those expungement laws for prior convictions. But for all the cases moving forward, a lot of this is now going to be automatic, and it should be. That's what doing justice on the back end is all about. And that's, I guess, what I ultimately want to say about this job. What I've learned in 20 years as a prosecutor is doing justice means more than just punishing people. And I've put people on death row. It means lifting up the poor and the oppressed also. It means doing the right thing by people who need second chances, and all of us do. It means saying that if nothing's if everything's a priority, then nothing is, and our priority has to be violent criminals and career criminals, and frankly, showing mercy for some of this other stuff. It doesn't mean convicting at all costs. It means doing justice, and that's a little bit different than I think I probably thought when I walked into this job in my 20s.
Ben, before we run out of time, let me leave you with this question, since this is the Business Journal's conference. I think just like schools, law enforcement, courts and crime issues are also very much intersecting, with business community, whether that be a recruiting quality of life issue or whether that just be the community that you want to live in. So my final question to you would be, you just kind of explain what you feel like your role and responsibility is. What roles and responsibility would you want to see from the business community in terms of being involved in some of the things that you're passionate about with this?
Well, I guess what I would say is this is our home, and we all want our kids to grow up in a safe environment and want what's best for them. It's harder to look at an adult who might be in a motel in Market Street who is a sex industry worker and remember she's someone's baby. It's harder to look at someone who has just committed a terrible offense who now has the right to remain silent, to remember that at one point they were a child living in poverty. It's too late to talk about choices and consequences after we've given them a right to remain silent. What I encourage the business community to do right now is to have the same strategic vision about justice that they do for the bottom line in their business, and say, if we want to get here, and we're here right now, what are the logical steps to get there? And if you're a science denier, please get out of the pond, because we need that at the courthouse and in medicine to do our jobs. And the stuff I've been talking about today, it certainly involves all of us, which is community. But what is undergirding it and what's behind it is really not new or novel, and it's field tested. A lot of this really does have some basis to it that goes back even to our Constitution, because when we talk about the Declaration of Independence, everyone focuses on life and liberty at the courthouse, but the pursuit of happiness is a God-given inalienable right also. And I think the business community, if they help with that, if you really keep focused on the pursuit of happiness for your employees first and for your customers second, you're going to make it a lot safer to live in this community. And by doing that, you're going to protect life and secure the blessings of liberty at the same time.
All right, well, that's a good note to end on. District Attorney Ben David, thank you for spending your lunch hour with us.
Thank you, Vicki. It's great to have you here.
And for all of you who are watching, thanks for joining us as well. If you came on late, we are going to be posting this on the Business Journal's YouTube page and sending it out. And that's here. I'm going to mute so the screen goes. Can you, by the way, introduce us to the Courthouse Dog?
That's Potter. And Paws for People, who's trained over 800 dogs for veterans, has trained him to be a part of this office to take care of the kids when they need to testify. And he comes home and lives with us every night. And he just celebrated 5 during COVID. So he's currently resting after a good lunch.
That's fantastic. Normally, you know, there's a lot of things we're not able to do because we're not in person for our annual BizExpo conference, but we never have had a dog guest appearance here. So that's one perk of doing
We're
it.
all learning to do new things during this pandemic, I guess.
All right, well, thank you very much for your time, and thanks everyone who stayed with us on the seminars and keynotes for the past 2 days. Feel free to send your feedback, and we hope you got a lot out of it. And have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Take care.